In the faded corner of a dusty trailer park in Leach, Texas, lived a girl the world had yet to notice. Her name was Sophie Lane. At 12 years old, she was quieter than most, with a voice soft enough to go unheard in a noisy classroom, and dreams so fragile even she wasn't sure if they were real. Her home, a tin-roofed trailer, barely holding itself together, stood like a forgotten line in a song that hadn't been sung in years. But behind those cracked walls, love existed in quiet gestures, the way her mother brushed her hair in the morning, or how Sophie left sticky notes beside the coffee pot that read, "Have a gentle day, Mom." Each morning, while other kids were still dreaming, Sophie was already up, tying her worn sneakers and pulling her hair into two clumsy braids. She didn't have time for cartoons or video games. Instead, she walked 3 blocks with her mother Joanne to the small bakery where they worked part-time. While her classmates debated breakfast cereal flavors, Sophie scrubbed countertops and polished glass displays, often humming quietly to herself as she worked. Her fingers smelled of yeast and vanilla. Her shoulders carried the invisible weight of responsibility far too early. Joanne was a wiry woman with kind eyes and hands cracked from years of labor. She often said, "You don't have to be rich to live kindly." It was her mantra, the soft armor she wore against a world that often turned cold when you had nothing to show for yourself. Sophie absorbed those words like sunlight. At school, while others teased her tattered uniform or her silence, she held onto her mother's voice like a lifeline. She rarely spoke back, not out of fear, but because she'd learned that silence sometimes said more. To most people at Winslow Elementary, Sophie was invisible. She sat in the back row, always alone. But behind those steady brown eyes was a girl who memorized poetry without meaning to, who noticed the way wind danced with leaves, who hummed lullabies passed down from her mother's cassette tapes. There was music inside her, pure, unshaped, untrained, but real. She didn't talk about it because talking would make it feel too vulnerable, too breakable. At recess, while other children played tag or recorded TikToks, Sophie sat beneath the school's only oak tree, scribbling lyrics in a faded composition notebook. No one asked to read them. She preferred it that way. Her songs weren't for show. They were for remembering her grandmother's laugh, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the way her mother's voice trembled when she sang Scarborough Fair during Sophie's childhood fevers. Her voice was a secret until the moment she chose to stop hiding it. And that moment came not with a spotlight or a stage, but with a simple crackling announcement over the school intercom. The principal's voice declared, "Talent Week sign-ups are open. Performers, please register outside the office by Wednesday." The hallway filled with noise. Sophie felt her chest flutter, and for the first time she thought maybe my voice could matter. The school buzzed with excitement after the announcement. Kids crowded around the bulletin board outside the office, comparing routines, swapping ideas. Some bragged about elaborate TikTok dances with backup lights. Others planned duets or drum solos. Sophie didn't approach the board. She just watched, standing far enough away to blend into the background the same way she always did. But that night something shifted. After dinner, Sophie sat at the tiny kitchen table in their trailer, the smell of bread still lingering in her clothes. Her mother had fallen asleep on the couch, an old cassette of lullabies still spinning in the dusty tape player. Sophie reached for her notebook fingers, tracing the lyrics she'd written months ago. "Are you going to Scarborough Fair?" The song wasn't flashy or modern. It was soft haunting, just like her mother used to sing it when Sophie was sick and scared. Quietly, she whispered to herself, "That's the one." The next morning, Sophie stood in front of the sign-up list. Her hands trembled, heart thumping loud enough to drown out the hallway noise. She hesitated. The list was long, lined with names that belonged to students who always got picked first for games or awards. Names everyone knew. But Sophie had made a promise to herself. She took a breath, then wrote in her tilted, careful handwriting, "Sophie Lane," singing. She stepped back, notebook in hand, and walked away. Within 10 minutes, the whispers started. "Wait, Sophie Lane! Singing, that's got to be a joke," a boy laughed. "Maybe she's going to sing through a rice cooker." The hallway echoed with giggles. Sophie heard it all. She didn't flinch. She just lowered her eyes and walked forward, hugging her notebook tighter as if it could block the sound. Back in class, no one said a word to her, but the sideways glances said enough. A few kids even mimed holding microphones and fake sobbing during lunch. But Sophie wasn't looking for applause. She didn't sign up for attention. She signed up to do something she had never dared before, to speak out loud with her voice. That evening, as she sat alone on the porch notebook, opened the last golden light of day brushing across the page, she didn't cry. Instead, she quietly rehearsed each word, tasting them like hope. They didn't know it yet, but Sophie Lane wasn't signing up for a joke. She was preparing to tell the truth. That night, long after the sun had set behind the trailer park's chain-link fences, Sophie sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor. Her cassette player hummed softly in the background. She had listened to the same track over and over again, her mother's voice from years ago, recorded during a rare, quiet night, singing Scarborough Fair. Sophie sang along now, quietly, letting each word settle in her chest before releasing it into the still air. Joanne passed by the doorway and paused. Her daughter didn't notice. She was too focused, too present. Her hands held the notebook gently like a fragile gift. Her voice was shaky but sincere, full of feeling that hadn't yet found polish. Joanne didn't say anything right away. She just watched, then walked in, knelt beside her, and placed a hand softly on her daughter's shoulder. "You know," Joanne said, her voice low with memory, "I once dreamed of standing on a stage too." Sophie blinked. She'd never heard that before. Joanne continued, "I wanted to be a singer when I was about your age. But when Grandma got sick, I had to quit school, stay home, take care of things. Life sort of redirected me." Her eyes drifted to the floor. "I don't regret it, but I've always wondered what it might have felt like." Sophie looked up, eyes glassy but bright. "Would you come?" she asked. Her voice was so quiet it could have been missed entirely. Joanne smiled. "Even if I have to walk there barefoot in the rain uphill both ways," she replied, teasing just enough to ease the tension. Sophie giggled, then nodded solemnly. "Then I'll do it." They sat together for a while, not talking, just existing. The mother who had once given up her voice, and the daughter preparing to use hers for the very first time. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, 2 generations of hope sat side by side on a floor that had never felt more like a stage. When Sophie finally returned to her practice, she wasn't alone. Joanne stayed close, humming the harmony under her breath. The dreams she had buried years ago were rising again, but not for herself. This time, they were wrapped inside the voice of the girl she'd raised. Rehearsal day arrived with little fanfare. Sophie walked into the school auditorium wearing her patched uniform, her braids slightly uneven, and her notebook tucked close to her chest. She had barely slept. Not because of nerves, but because she couldn't stop hearing the song in her head, each line like a step towards something unknown and enormous. She was the last performer on the list that day. The other students had elaborate setups. Some had Bluetooth speakers, synchronized routines, pre-recorded tracks. A boy played electronic drums while his friend danced in LED sneakers. A girl twirled in a sequin cape, singing pop hits with hand gestures choreographed to perfection. Teachers clapped. Students whooped. Sophie watched quietly from the side, not out of jealousy but awe. When her name was called, there was a pause in the air. Next, Sophie Lane, the music teacher, announced, "She'll be singing Scarborough Fair, no backing track." A few eyebrows rose. Someone in the back stifled a laugh. "Really, a cappella?" someone whispered. Sophie walked slowly onto the stage. No spotlight, no mic, just her. She stood still. Her heart raced. Her throat tightened. But then she saw her mother seated halfway back next to a teacher. Joanne gave her the smallest of nods, and that was all Sophie needed. She took a breath, and then she began, "Are you going to Scarborough Fair?" The first note wavered slightly, then steadied. The room changed. It was like someone had turned down the world. A teacher pouring coffee froze mid-pour. The music instructor who had been jotting notes slowly set her pen down. Sophie's voice was small, but it had gravity. It wasn't loud. It was true. Every word carried the quiet ache of someone who had been invisible too long. When she finished, there was silence. No clapping. Not yet. Because everyone had forgotten how to react. The girl they expected nothing from had just given them everything. Sophie stepped down, still holding her notebook, still trembling slightly, but no longer afraid. She had sung, and the room had listened. The morning of the talent show arrived with bright skies and a breeze that tugged gently at the school banners. Winslow Elementary was draped in balloons and signs. The LED screen outside flashed, "Let your light shine." Sophie arrived early, dressed in her only white dress, neatly ironed by her mother the night before. Her braids were tidier today, and in her hands she held her notebook like a talisman. Her mother walked beside her, wearing her work apron tied over her skirt. Her eyes were tired from the night shift, but her steps were steady. She never let go of Sophie's hand. They waited in the wings as one act after another played out, cheering friends, sparkling costumes, wireless mics, laughter. Sophie sat alone. No one greeted her. A few pointed. One student whispered, "This is going to be gold. Get your phone ready." The teacher turned MC cleared her throat. And now our final performance, singing Scarborough Fair. Please welcome Sophie Lane. A few polite claps, some giggles. Sophie walked onto the stage, each step deliberate. She couldn't see the crowd. The lights were too bright. But she knew exactly where her mother was, third row left side by the window. She took a breath and began. Her voice rose gently like mist in the morning. Soft, clear, honest. The first lines passed over the audience unnoticed. Then something shifted. The room quieted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Students who were ready to laugh lowered their phones. Teachers turned. Parents leaned in. When Sophie sang the final note, she didn't move. Not right away. It was as if she too needed to understand what had just happened. And then, from the third row, her mother stood alone, hand on her heart. 1 second passed, then 2. Then the room exploded into applause. Sophie Lane stood center stage, her small frame framed by the soft glow of overhead lights. She looked out over the audience, though most faces were hidden behind the blinding brightness. She didn't search for approval. She didn't even search for recognition. She only searched for her mother, whom she knew was sitting in the third row, watching, waiting, believing. With a faded notebook pressed to her side and her heart pounding like a quiet drum, Sophie took one deep breath and opened her mouth to sing. "Are you going to Scarborough Fair?" The words drifted out delicate and unadorned. There was no music, no microphone, no stage effects, just her voice as honest and unguarded as a whispered secret. At first, the crowd stirred, whispering, shuffling, but as her voice filled the air, something unusual happened. The fidgeting stopped. The phones lowered. The auditorium leaned in. A hush spread across the room like fog rolling into a valley. Teachers who had been correcting papers slowly looked up. A parent who had been scrolling through emails slipped their phone into their pocket. Even a janitor sweeping near the back paused, broom mid-air. Sophie's voice wasn't loud. It wasn't polished, but it had something no training could create: truth. She sang every note with her whole heart, each syllable shaped by years of longing, loneliness, and love. The melody wrapped around the room like a lullaby from another time. When she reached the final line, "Remember me to one who lives there," Sophie held the last note longer than expected, as if to give it space to land. Then silence. Not awkward silence, but the kind that blooms after something sacred. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the audience forgot how to respond to something so fragile and real. Then slowly, an elderly man in the second row stood up. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his cane resting beside him. He didn't say a word. He simply placed his hand over his chest and bowed his head. A few seconds later, a second person rose. Then another. Within moments, the entire auditorium stood together, young and old student and teacher parent and peer offering not loud applause but reverence. Sophie stood quietly, hands still at her sides. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. but her eyes shimmered in the light, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like the girl in the back row. She felt seen, not because she demanded attention, but because her voice had asked to be heard, and the world finally listened. After the performance, as the audience filtered out in whispers of awe and softened footsteps, Sophie sat backstage alone, clutching her notebook with quiet disbelief. She didn't expect praise. She didn't expect anything. Just the chance to say what she needed to say in the only way she knew how. But as she prepared to leave, a woman approached with a presence as gentle as her voice. She wore a white blouse with a conductor's pin on the collar and a name badge that read, Clara Jensen. Her eyes were kind but sharp, like someone who had heard 1,000 voices and was waiting for the one that would move her. "You must be Sophie," she said softly. Sophie nodded. Clara smiled. "I'm the conductor of the City Children's Choir. I came to watch my daughter perform earlier, but it was you who made me stay until the end." Sophie blinked, unsure of what to say. Clara continued, "Your voice, it's rare. Not perfect, but deeply human. I'd like to invite you to audition at our studio. We have a scholarship program for students like you." She paused. "You don't need to sing like anyone else. You just need to keep singing like you." Sophie looked up at her mother, who had just arrived, her hands still dusted with flour from the bakery, eyes glistening. Joanne didn't hesitate. She took her daughter's hand and said, "Go, sweetheart. This is the voice the world has been waiting to hear." Clara handed them her card and added gently, "We'll be in touch soon." Sophie nodded slowly, the gravity of the moment still sinking in. In that instant, her mother's sacrifice, her own courage, and Clara's belief wove together to form something brand new possibility. That night, as they walked home under the stars, Sophie said nothing. Her notebook stayed in her backpack, but her mother could tell something inside her had changed. Sophie had walked into that school as the girl nobody believed in, and now, for the first time, someone had offered her not just a chance, but a future. At home, Sophie placed the conductor's card beside her cassette player and sat by the window. Her mother watched her from the kitchen, thinking of all the mornings they had cleaned floors and counted pennies, and knowing now those mornings had not been in vain. The following Saturday, Sophie stepped through the glass doors of a professional recording studio in downtown Amarillo. It was a quiet building tucked between an old pharmacy and a barber shop, but inside it felt like a whole different world. Acoustic panels lined the walls. Soft lighting bathed the room in a calm, golden hue. Outside, traffic buzzed, but in here, time stood still. Clara Jensen welcomed them at the entrance. Ready for a little adventure, she asked, her tone light, her eyes encouraging. Sophie nodded shyly. She was wearing a clean white blouse, her jeans pressed and tidy. No makeup, no styled hair, just herself and the old notebook she held like a charm. Clara introduced her to Leo, the studio engineer, an older man with salt and pepper stubble and a skeptical look that faded once he heard why they were there. "This is the kid?" Leo asked, raising an eyebrow. "Trust me," Clara said. "Just let her sing." Sophie stepped into the recording booth, her palms slightly damp. Leo adjusted the mic to her height, the headphones swallowing her ears. Clara stood outside the glass, offering a supportive nod. "You can sing Scarborough Fair again, or anything you'd like," she said. Sophie looked out at her mother, who waited just behind the control room window. Then she looked back at Clara. "I'll sing my mother's song," she whispered. The track was blank. There would be no music, just silence and her voice. And as she began to sing, that same mist-like tone returned, pure, trembling, and beautiful. When the last note faded, no one spoke. Leo slowly leaned into his mic. "You haven't had training, have you?" Sophie shook her head. "Well," he said after a pause, "you've got what people pay years for and never find. You've got heart." Clara smiled, already downloading the file. That same afternoon, she sent the recording to the Emerson School of Music. Attached was a note, "She's the one." 3 weeks later, a pale blue envelope arrived at Sophie's trailer. Inside was a letter of acceptance from Emerson Conservatory's summer scholarship program in Austin, Texas. Full tuition, travel, lodging, everything. Sophie's hands shook as she read it. Her mother cried quietly, holding her tight. For a moment, neither of them could believe it. But it was real. Sophie Lane was going to Emerson. The conservatory stood atop a hill surrounded by oaks and red brick buildings. Sophie arrived with her mother and a single suitcase. She stepped into a dormitory filled with kids from New York, San Francisco, and overseas, most with vocal coaches since they were 6. They carried designer bags and spoke in technical terms. Sophie from Leach, Texas, carried only her notebook and a song. The classes were intense. The first workshop on vocal anatomy overwhelmed her. She couldn't name her vocal range. She didn't know about diaphragmatic support or resonance placement. A girl from Boston whispered to a friend, "Looks like they picked the wrong student this year." Sophie overheard it. She said nothing, but the words burned. Each night she sat on the dorm porch watching lights twinkle in the distance. One night Clara found her there and handed her a mug of mint tea. "You okay?" Sophie hesitated, then whispered, "I don't think I belong here." Clara looked at her with quiet intensity. "Sophie, I was once a girl who didn't belong either, but one professor told me something I never forgot. Technique can be taught. Emotion cannot. You already have what can't be learned." Sophie stared at the stars, unsure if she believed it, but she held those words close. In the days that followed, she studied harder, practiced longer, and when the final performance was announced, she knew exactly what song she'd sing, not to impress, but to remember. The night of the final performance arrived with rain falling softly outside Willow Hall Auditorium. Parents filled the seats' umbrellas tucked under chairs. Local reporters, musicians, and scouts from conservatories lined the aisles. Sophie waited backstage wearing a light blue dress her mother's friend had sewn from 2 old blouses. Her hair was tied back loosely. Around her neck hung the only piece of jewelry she owned, a tiny sun-shaped pendant her mother gave her for her 10th birthday. She was the last performer of the night. The MC took the stage, and now from Leach, Texas, Sophie Lane performing "You Are My Sunshine." A murmur spread. Some in the crowd expected a shaky folk tune. Others didn't expect anything at all. Sophie walked onto the stage, slowly, eyes down, then up, searching for her mother. She couldn't see her through the lights, but she knew. 4th row, center left. Joanne was there. She opened her mouth. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Her voice trembled on the first word, but by the second it was steady. By the third, it carried. Her tone was soft, too soft for a hall this size. But it didn't matter. Each word was memory. Of rain, of bakery leftovers, of holding hands and holding on. She sang like someone who had no stage, and yet every right to be on one. When she reached the final line, "Please don't take my sunshine away," she held the note longer than written. The room fell silent, not stiff, but spellbound. Then one person rose. Her mother. She didn't clap. She just stood, hand on heart. Then another stood. Then another. And finally, the entire room erupted, not in chaos, but in gratitude. The next morning, Clara met Sophie and Joanne in a small diner down the street. She slid a white envelope across the table. "Congratulations," she said. "The board met last night. They're offering you full admission to Emerson's year-round program. No re-audition needed." Joanne gasped, hand to her mouth. Sophie's eyes widened. Then came the question that mattered most. "Can I bring my mum with me?" Clara didn't hesitate. "If your mother is the reason you sing like that," she said, "then the school would be honored." And just like that, 2 lives changed. From a trailer park in Leach to a conservatory in Austin. From scraped shoes and faded uniforms to a place where Sophie's voice could keep growing. Years later, Sophie Lane sat in a TV studio being interviewed as a celebrated folk singer and songwriter. "What moment changed everything for you?" the host asked. Sophie smiled, eyes distant. "The moment my mother stood up," she said. "Before anyone else believed in me, she did. And that was enough." Her story spread across the world, not just as a tale of talent, but of love, courage, and quiet defiance. Teachers shared her video in classrooms. Parents whispered her lyrics to their children. Young girls, uncertain of their place, began to believe they too had a voice. Sophie Lane never chased fame. She didn't need to. Her songs weren't designed for headlines. They were written for people with tired hearts and quiet dreams. She had once been a girl in the back row, silent, overlooked, waiting. But when she finally sang, she didn't just find her voice. She gave others permission to find theirs too.